Hello. I wonder if someone asked you what Jesus's most defining quality was, what you would say. Perhaps you'd point towards his ability to perform miraculous signs and wonders. Perhaps you'd explore the wisdom he displayed through his preaching and teaching. Or maybe you would look to the love he displayed for us on the cross. Well, I want to spend these next few minutes looking at one of Jesus's most consistently prophesied qualities, and that is that he would come as a servant. In the book of Isaiah, there are these 4 songs that occur towards the end, and in each of them we get a different picture of the servanthood of Jesus. And one of them is in Isaiah 42, which I'll read the opening verses to in a moment. But as we read them, I want you to think about what kind of servant Jesus was coming to be. So in Isaiah 42, we read these words: "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight, and I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. But in faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. And in his teaching the islands will put their hope." So what does this passage show us about what it meant for Jesus to be a servant? Well, first of all, it shows us that to be a servant was to be privileged. I don't know about you, but when I think of servants, my mind goes to British TV shows like Downton Abbey and The Crown, where we see these kind of figures scurrying around with very few lines to say, just serving the whims of those above them. And yet for God, when here he speaks of being a servant, he is speaking of someone he loves. You almost couldn't pick more compassionate and gracious words than the ones God uses to describe this figure. He says, "Here is my servant who I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight." And I wonder sometimes, if you were to ask someone, what does it mean to be privileged by God? Well, maybe we would look towards an intimacy and closeness with him. We'd say it's about experiencing a closeness with God. Maybe some of us, if we're being truthful, might say, well, it's about success. I know that God privileges me if I do well, if I'm fruitful in life. But actually here we see that God, if we want to be people who are upheld by God, if we want to be people who know that God has chosen us and delights in us, then we are to be people who are his servants. So first of all, to be a servant was to be privileged. Secondly, Jesus came to be a servant who sought justice. 3 times in these verses that word occurs. It says that this servant will come to bring justice to the nations. In his faithfulness, he will bring forth justice, and he will establish justice on earth. In other words, for Jesus, to come as a servant wasn't merely to seek the service of the wealthy and privileged and powerful of society, but rather bring justice for those who needed it most. And indeed, as we look at the start of Jesus' ministry, in Luke chapter 4, in these words I know we've read before, he says this. He says, "The Spirit is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoner, recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free." This is the justice Jesus came to bring. Good news for those who are poor, freedom for those held captive, and recovery of sight for those who are blind. Tim Keller says about God's desire for justice. He says the storyline of the whole Bible is God's repeated identification with the wretched, powerless, and the marginalized. And so when we, in our context, even though it's much different to the one Jesus lived in, when we see the poor in need of provision, when we see those imprisoned for unjust reasons needing freedom, and when we encounter those who feel down-pressed or trodden upon, we know that we can look at them in the way that Jesus did and know that they need justice. So to be a servant was to be privileged, it was to seek justice, but lastly it was to bring hope. In those final words of Isaiah's prophecy, he says, in his teaching the islands will place their hope. And I think more than anything else, the Christmas story has been coming back to me as one of hope. Hope that in a small, dark stable, God can bring the most transformative moments in human history. Hope that for a family of little renown, of almost no wealth, and of decreasing respect, God can begin a story of justice and peace for the nations. And hope that even for a family with an enormously uncertain future, that he was going to place in their midst one who would be God with them each step of the way. And so for Jesus, when we see him prophesied about as one who would bring hope, we see him as the ultimate servant. The one serving God, but also bringing justice and hope to a world in desperate need. And as much as the temptation here is to say simply, well, this is how we should act. We should be people who know we're privileged and seek justice and bring hope. Actually, I think it's worth reflecting just simply upon the reality that this is Jesus. This is the one that we are called to know. This is the one that we can centre our lives around. This is the one that we have a thirst and yearning for in these times of challenge. Jesus, our wonderful servant, who brings us justice, hope, and invites us into his family. Lord, we thank you that you did not leave us alone, but you sent us a servant in the form of your Son. Lord, help us learn from this great servant how we might serve those around us.